And we will be in John chapter 18, starting in verse 13, once we get into today's passage. And next week, we'll either be finishing chapter 18 or starting chapter 19, most likely finishing chapter 18, as I don't see that we'll likely get through of all 18 today. So Doug, could I ask you to open a word of prayer?
Father in heaven, we just thank you for another beautiful day, a time to come and worship you. We pray our minds and hearts are geared not only to your word, but in prayer and fellowship with one another. We pray that you be with Lawrence. You continue to bring forth the study in John. Our minds and hearts are open to not only receive it and understand it, but apply to our lives for your glory and our good. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.
All right, so we'll be in John chapter 18, starting in verse 13. And chapter 18, its focus is on Jesus' betrayal by Judas, his arrest, and then his trial. And last week we looked at the betrayal and arrest as the first part, where Judas had left the Last Supper. Really, at Jesus' command, Judas had been excused from that Last Supper. And Judas at that point recognized that Jesus knew that he was going to betray him. So he goes to the high priest who've hired him with the 30 pieces of silver, lets them know they have to put the plan in motion now because they've kind of been found out already. And so in some ways, the timing of this, again, is very much in God's control as far as his hour. Because prior to this, we've seen in the Gospel of John where they tried to kill him and he hid himself. Well, now, Judas and those who've hired him to betray Jesus aren't quite ready yet. They weren't planning on doing this in the midst of the Passover festivities because a lot of the people planning this had really important roles to play in the Passover that made it difficult for them to, also kill somebody at the same time and hold a trial and that sort of thing without becoming unceremonially unclean also. That becomes a problem for some of them throughout this. So they're a little bit of a disarray. They managed to send enough witness, likely with Judas, to Pontius Pilate that they're able to recruit this group of Roman soldiers and get the authority to take the Roman soldiers. So the Roman soldiers, guided by Judas and also the Jewish temple police we saw last week, go to the garden and arrest Jesus. And so we left off last week where Jesus is arrested, he's bound in the garden, and he's being taken to the first part of the trial. There's two different pieces of the trial that are recorded here in chapter 18 in John. One is before Jewish authorities, the other is between Roman authorities. In the entire trial sequence throughout all of the Gospels, Jesus is sent from the Jewish authorities to the Roman authorities to different Roman authorities, and there's all these different pieces and parts to it. But part of the picture here is we talked about last time how that Garden of Gethsemane was to the, it's my map here, was to the east of Jerusalem on the temple side. And this would have been the traditional location where the lambs would have been raised for sacrifice in the temple, and especially for the Passover time. And so here, where we ended last time, this picture of Jesus being bound like a sacrifice, being led from the location where the lambs for temple sacrifice would have been raised into Jerusalem. And he's going to be brought first to the high priest. And as part of the lamb being brought to sacrifice, would have been brought to the high priest, and the high priest would have examined the lamb to make sure it was a perfect lamb without blemish and fit for sacrifice. Now, ironically here, the high priest and those who are putting Jesus on trial are looking for faults, the excuse to kill him. But in God's plan, they're ironically fulfilling the finding no fault in the lamb who is the sacrifice. And in this case, the true Lamb of God, the true sacrifice. Though at the same time that Jesus is being bound and arrested, we see in Matthew that all of his disciples forsake him and flee. And understandably so. They don't want to be arrested as being co-conspirators of whatever Jesus is being arrested for. There is a large group of armed soldiers, temple police, Jewish authorities who have come to arrest Jesus. And the disciples really don't want to be arrested also. And it's also not their place to be arrested yet. They also likely have to be really confused as far as what is going on, despite the fact that Jesus has been preparing them that he is leaving and he is going to die. The realization of how that was happening is only just starting to dawn on them. So, scared and afraid, they scatter. We are going to see that two of them kind of regroup and start following back in the passage that we're in today. But before we get into that, back to the map here. There's a handout at the back that has this map on it also. And before we get into what's going on here in John chapter 18, starting at verse 13, we'll talk a little bit about the layout of the city of Jerusalem and where likely these events are occurring, and some of the players or characters, so to speak, the people who are showing up in this event. So, because this is Passover time, this would be in Jerusalem. And we have this section that we looked at last time, starting in the Garden of Gethsemane, just outside of the Kidron Valley, but it would still be considered part of the Jerusalem city limits, because during Passover time, those who'd come to the Passover would not have left the city limits during that time period. That would be considered making yourself unceremonially clean, and then would not be able to participate in the rest of Passover. Which is why Jesus and his disciples, after the final supper, would not have traveled all the way to Bethany, because Bethany would have been outside of the city limits, and that's where they often stayed, at the house of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha. So Jesus, after he's arrested, well, I should back up a little bit. Down in the lower kind of southwest corner of the upper city in Jerusalem is the traditional location where it's thought the upper room was, where the Last Supper was. There's no definitive evidence of exactly where that was, but that's likely where it was. And it's likely in the upper city area in what would have been considered the Mount Zion area, very close to where the high priest would have had their residence also. And so at the end of the farewell discourse and the prayer in chapter 17, Jesus and his disciples would have traveled from that location out of the city walls to the Garden of Gethsemane. While Jesus was doing that farewell discourse with the 11 disciples, Judas had been dismissed because he was not one of Jesus' sheep. He had been dismissed and commanded to go do what you were going to do. So he likely would have traveled from the upper room to the high priest's compound to let them know, Jesus knows the plan here. We need to set this in motion. So that's where Judas is. They would then go from the high priest to where Pilate is. He would have been in the Antonia fortress, which would have been a fortress that the Romans had basically right abutting to the Temple Mount area, just north of the Temple Mount. And that's what's labeled Pilate in there. So Pontius Pilate would have been there. Judas would have betrayed Jesus there by giving witness to Pilate to get them Roman soldiers. So, and while they're doing this, they would also pick up the temple police, and then they head to the garden. They arrest Jesus, and we're going to see here in verse 13, the first place they take him is to Annas. Now, Annas has showed up already in the Gospel of John, and Annas was the high priest from AD 6 to AD 15. Now, by Jewish law, he would have been high priest for life. And so throughout here, who's called high priest kind of slips back and forth from Annas to Caiaphas. And the reason for that is, from the Jewish perspective, they would have potentially considered Annas to still be the high priest. Now, the reason his high priesthood ended in AD 15 is the Roman governor at that point, who preceded Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, Valerius Gratus, deposed Annas as the high priest. So this is a Roman decision, not a Jewish decision. Now, the Romans, when they did things like that, didn't want to get too much social unrest. So even though Annas should have been, by Jewish law, high priest for life, when he was deposed, the Romans at least then appointed somebody who was one of his sons as the next high priest, which would have been within Jewish law. So they were kind of okay with that. Evidently, the next son of Annas, who was appointed high priest, wasn't much to the liking of the Romans either, because he didn't last much more than a year or so. And there was a series of 5 of Annas' sons who went through being the high priest in a fairly short amount of time. And then under Pontius Pilate, he deposed the last of Annas' sons. Annas had run out of sons at that point to be appointed. So Caiaphas, his son-in-law, was then appointed by Pontius Pilate as the high priest. And we'll see in this passage, he's also referred to as high priest. And he would have been the high priest in that year. So we have Caiaphas would have been the official high priest under Romans' appointing, whereas some would have still considered Annas to be the high priest as far as the right high priest under the Jewish law. He was kind of problematic as a high priest, though, in that he was a big reason why, back towards the beginning of the Gospel of John, Jesus came into the temple and cleared the temple of the money changers. Those money changers were why Annas was rich, and why Caiaphas was rich, and why their entire family and sons were rich. Because what they had done is at feast times, individuals would need to bring sacrifices. And they would often be individuals who traveled in a long way. So because of that, it's difficult to keep a lamb in good condition that would pass the inspection. So it was set up initially in the Mount of Olives, not far from the Garden of Gethsemane, an area where travelers could purchase a lamb and then take it to the temple for sacrifice. To make more money, Annas and his sons had moved that into the temple area itself, likely the court of Gentiles, and changed that from a place of prayer and worship into a money-making bazaar. And along with that, because sacrifices could only be purchased with Jewish currency, anybody traveling in who had currency from their reason that wasn't Judean Jewish currency needed to exchange that money. So that would go on there also. And what Annas and his sons had set up is a system where first, with the money exchanging, they would charge a fee, and it was a much higher fee than the normal charge, and they were making money off that. Secondly, they then were also selling the lambs at a really, really high markup, and people didn't have a choice. They had to buy them, or they had to travel back home and get one. Now, some people, if they brought their own lamb, how Annas dealt with that is he and his sons, being the high priest, were the ones who signed off on, is this lamb have any blemishes or not, and can it be fit for a sacrifice? So if somebody brought their own, they would say, no, this has a blemish, it's no good, and reject it. And at that point, the individual would have to go back home and get another one. And if they were local, they might be able to do that, but if they've traveled in from Galilee, they couldn't do that. And so then they'd be forced to exchange their money and buy an overpriced lamb, basically, so that they were able to do the sacrifice. And this became known as the Bazaar of Annas. And this is part of the reason why Jesus cleared the temple that we saw at the beginning of the Gospel of John. Now, when we talked about that, something I mentioned that is in the other 3 Gospels, the clearing of the temple doesn't occur at the beginning of Jesus' ministry. It occurs right at the end, at the last Passover. And different commentators have different views on that. Some think that John, because John doesn't always use strict chronology, may have moved it thematically to the beginning. Others think that, well, no, the other writers moved it. And then some think the explanation is Jesus did it twice. He did it at the first Passover that he attended as part of his ministry, that kicked off his ministry, basically, and then he did it right before his crucifixion. And it's very likely that that is what happened. He cleaned it once. 3 years later, he had to clean it again because they were right back at doing it. Which is one of the reasons why in the other Gospels we see some of the witnesses bring that up as part of the evidence against him being a troublemaker, basically. So Annas very much is involved in this as being the former high priest and possibly those of the Jewish things. Also, he kind of has an axe to grind with Jesus because Jesus has at least once upset his money-making bazaar and possibly twice. And he's a rich family, and that was cutting into their profit margins for possibly 2 Passovers, which would have been their big money-making events, because that's where they would have had their most sales. And Caiaphas would have been his son-in-law. Pilate would have been the Roman governor of Judea. He's one of the individuals who shows up in the New Testament scripture where there's archaeological evidence outside of the Bible that he existed. In the 1960s in Caesarea, which would have been where his seat of power was in Judea, an inscription was found naming Pontius Pilate as prefect in Caesarea, as governor in that area. Now, he would have been in Jerusalem, as we talked about last time, for the Passover, because with the Passover, the Romans knew this was a time when all the Jewish males would come and congregate at Jerusalem. Secondly, they were celebrating God delivering them from Pharaoh in Egypt. And so the Romans had concern that this could be a large group of Jewish men who might decide it's time for God to deliver them from Rome. And so Pontius Pilate would come to Jerusalem during the Passover times and some of the other feasts, and with a large garrison of Roman soldiers at the Antonia Forest, located very conveniently right next to the temple, which potentially they'd see as being the ground zero for something like that happening. At the same time, Herod, who would have been the Roman governor appointed over Galilee at this point, he also would have traveled to Jerusalem, and he would have been in Herod's palace in the upper city. He doesn't get a mention in the Gospel of John, but during the proceedings, after Jesus is brought to Annas, Annas then sends him to Caiaphas, and then from Caiaphas, and Caiaphas would likely have been in the temple, even though Caiaphas, as the high priest, would have lived likely in the same house compound as Annas because they were family. At that night in the Passover, because he was the appointed high priest, he would not have been at home. He would have been sequestered in the temple for the sacrifices that he would have been doing the next day so that he wouldn't be defiled. So he'd be sequestered in the temple so that he would be kept ceremonially clean. From there, he's sent to Pilate. Not recorded in John, Jesus is sent from Pilate to Herod. Pilate sends him to Herod likely for 3 reasons. One, Pilate kind of wanted to get rid of this problem without causing a riot. Because he didn't really want to crucify Jesus, but on the other hand, he saw if he ruled in favor of Jesus, this might cause a Jewish riot, and he was there to prevent that type of thing. So he finds that Jesus is from Galilee, and is like, oh, great. Herod's the one who's the authority in Galilee. I'll send him to Herod. And likely there was kind of a double reason for that, is that Pilate and Herod didn't really like each other. Herod had converted kind of to Judaism. Pilate very much had not. At some point, Pilate had put up votive banners in the Antonia fortress right next to the temple that were in honor of Roman gods, which would be very offensive to the Jewish people that close to the temple. Herod, having kind of converted to Judaism, didn't like this. He went to Pilate, said, you got to take those down. This is wrong. Pilate's like, nope, not going to do that. Herod then went around Pilate and went to Rome and appealed to the Roman Senate, and the Roman Senate realized that Herod was kind of right, that this was a bad move on Pilate's part to keep peace, and told Pilate, you got to take this down. You can't do this. And so Pilate found out that Herod had told on him, and so they were not particularly friendly. So it could partially be Pilate was, this is a hot potato I want to get rid of. Let me send it to the other Roman governor who I don't like much, and we'll make it his problem, and he can figure it out. The end result of that is the two of them became friends after that, over that, ironically. And Herod had aspirations also to follow in his father's footsteps, Herod the Great, who was king of a much larger area than Herod Antipas was. And he had aspirations to that. Pontius Pilate, of course, didn't like that because Herod the Antipas becoming king would have put him over Pilate, and clearly that wasn't what he wanted. So partially, the Roman governors passing him back and forth was a little bit of one-upmanship on their part also in this event. And then from Herod, Jesus is sent back to Pilate, which is where chapter 19 picks up in the Gospel of John. So that's kind of an overview of kind of the geography and where the trial is moving back and forth. I'd mention also that Judas's movements would have been initially from the upper room to the high priest's house, Annas' house, then to Pontius Pilate, and then with the soldiers to the garden. There are two different thoughts of where he ends up next. Some think he ends up back in the courtyard here. Others, more likely because of the timeline, this is where, after the arrest, he's racked with guilt and remorse. He goes to the temple to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, who's hired him with the 30 shekels of silver, throws him at their feet, and is like, I want nothing of this. And they're like, this isn't our problem. You collected the money. You've done the deed. And he goes and kills himself. So it's likely in between Jesus going from Annas' house to Caiaphas to Pilate, somewhere in there before he gets to Pilate, Judas kills himself. And this is a problem for the Jewish authorities, because part of his role as a betrayer was to be a witness. And by the time they bring Jesus to Pontius Pilate, they've just lost their star witness, because their star witness has just killed himself. Which is why they then scramble and try to put together other witnesses. So that's where we are. Let's get into chapter 18, starting at verse 13. So verse 13 and 14. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. So, as setting the stage here, Jesus is being brought, bound by Roman soldiers, temple police. Some of the Sanhedrin were likely there, the Jewish officials. The high priest's servant, Malchus, was involved, and some other servants. Bring them to Annas first. And here, John gives a little bit of background. That Annas was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, and Caiaphas was the high priest that year. And that wording is important, because what John is pointing out is that Caiaphas was the appointed high priest by Rome during that year and several other years, as opposed to Annas, who not only being Caiaphas' high priest, but some of the Jews would have seen him still as the rightful high priest, because he was high priest and he should have been high priest for life. So he's brought here. We're going to see in a couple verses a clue that when he's brought to Annas, he's not brought to the temple in the Sanhedrin. A trial like this, a Jewish trial, should be held by Jewish law in a public location, which would have been the temple, presiding by the Sanhedrin, and a minimum of 23 out of the 71 had to be present. Also, that trial by Jewish law could not take part at night because there was concern of conspiracy at night, basically. So already we're starting to see that they're starting this trial not in a public place, not in the temple with the Sanhedrin where it's supposed to be, and they're starting it at nighttime still, breaking Jewish law. Arnold Fruchtenbaum, in his book, points out 22 ways that throughout this passage they broke Jewish law in their trials. And I'll point out some of those, but we're not going to go through all 22 of them. But they're bringing to Annas' private house. Now, part of the reason we know that is we see that the doorkeeper in a few verses is a servant girl. The doorkeeper at the temple would not have been a woman. A doorkeeper at a private residence might be. Because at a private residence, it was up to the individual who owned that private residence to decide who was going to be the doorkeeper. So this is Annas' private home that this trial is being started in. We also have Caiaphas, who enters here. He's not here physically yet, but as a son-in-law, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. And John adds in here in verse 14, now it was Caiaphas who advised the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. Now in Caiaphas' mind, when he made that statement, is he and Annas, his father, and the Jewish authorities wanted to get rid of Jesus. And so he pointed out that, well, it'd probably be better for them and for their power and authority over the temple that they get rid of Jesus. So in his mind, the better for the people was better for his pocketbook and Annas' pocketbook and the other Jewish authorities' pocketbook. But ironically, he was correct. That it was expedient that Jesus should die for the people because that was God's plan. That's why Jesus was sent. So kind of ironically here, both sides of this trial want the same outcome, just for different reasons. The prosecutor side, Annas and the Jewish authorities, they want to get rid of Jesus so they remain in power and get rid of this individual who they see as a troublemaker. From God's plan, though, God sent Jesus to die for his people, for the world, that all would have life through him. So it's kind of ironic that John points this out here, that this is a trial where both sides kind of have the same end goal in mind, Jesus dying, but for very different reasons. One, because they've rejected him, and the other because it is God who loved the world that sent his Son to die. So now this next section, 15 to 18, 19 to 24, and 25 to 27. Even though they're written, and if you read them in chronological order, you might think that, okay, first Peter denies Jesus. That event went on in verse 15 to 18, and then that was followed by Jesus being questioned, and then that was followed by Peter's second and third denial, and then that was followed by the next section that we'll get into next week. But the way these are written, they're written interleaved together. And this is a common literary structure that was used in Greek literature and in first century literature to interleave here to show that these were happening simultaneously. So what was going on with 15, 18, 25, and 27, that event was all happening at the exact same time that the events in 19 to 24 in the center were occurring. So when we get to verse 24 and when we get to verse 27, were at the same point in time in the proceedings. These are going on together. And the section 15 to 18 is in the courtyard in Annas' home compound. 25 and 27 is also in that courtyard area. So that is outside of Annas' main house, but within his courtyard area. Where 19 to 24, with Jesus being questioned, that is inside Annas' house. So there's this movement in here where John is letting the reader check up on what's going on out in the courtyard, what's going on inside the courtroom, so to speak, what's going on outside in the courtyard at the same time. So it's jumping back and forth, and it's doing that partially because these are complementary, going together. And what we have is out in the courtyard, we have one of Jesus' disciples, Peter, being questioned and denying. Inside the courtroom, we have Jesus being questioned and not denying. And so it starts with, in verse 15, and Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. And now that disciple was known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside, and then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to her who kept the door and brought Peter in. So here we see the one who's keeping the door is a female maidservant, which is why this is a private residence. This is Annas' private residence, where a trial should not be going on under Jewish law. But it is. We also have, even though at Jesus' rest in the garden, all the disciples scatter and flee, at some point, Peter is kind of following. And with him is another disciple. And that other disciple is not named, and we don't know with 100% certainty who that is. Traditionally, that's John. And very likely that's who it is. Because throughout the Gospel of John, John never mentions himself by name, and that would have been literary tradition. The author would not have mentioned himself by name if he was one of the individuals involved with the narrative. The other reason is, there we go, and later in verse 20, after Jesus' death and resurrection, Simon Peter and an other disciple run to the tomb. And from the other Gospels, it's very clear that it was Simon Peter and John who is here. So there is, within this close proximity, as far as in the literary structure, John is referred to as the other disciple. And additionally, when you have two disciples together, and one of them is Peter, the other one is often John. Those two often are seen together. So if we have Peter and another disciple, the probability is the other disciple is John, both of them being fishermen from Galilee. So they were often together. Some other clues that we have that it was likely John. Throughout the Gospels, all of the Gospels record that at Jesus' arrest, a servant of the high priest has his ear cut off by Peter. Only in Luke, the doctor, is it mentioned that Jesus heals that high priest's ear. It's going to be interesting that the individual who's interested in healing with his medical background is the one who records that part that Jesus heals the ear, because that was important to him and probably quite fascinating to him, and he probably wished in his practice he could do that type of thing, because normally that wasn't what he would have been able to do. But in the Gospel of John, there's a detail that's not in any of the other Gospels. And that is that the servant's ear, the servant who gets his ear cut off, his name is Malchus. John knows the servant's name. And the servant is one of the high priest servants, one of Annas' servants. And here in verse 15, this other disciple who comes was known to the high priest. So the fact that John knew the high priest's household well enough that he knew the servants by name is a clue that very likely he was known by the high priest's household. And so when he came to the door, the servant girl knew him. She had no qualms with him. It's like, yeah, hi, John, come on in. Whereas Peter, she didn't know. Peter, we see in verse 16, stood outside the door. Initially, he does get to be ushered in, but he stands outside the door. Now, some who think this wasn't John are like, well, John was a fisherman from Galilee. How would he know the high priestly family from Judea? They're entirely different socioeconomic classes. Well, part of the problem with that argument is that argument makes sense from a Greek standpoint, because in Greek culture, there would be a distinction and they would not mix the upper class with the lower class. But in first century Jewish culture, that wasn't true at all. The high priestly families would have social relationships with the one who was their butcher or their fish provider or something like that. Also from Mark, I'm not going to turn there or put that, but Mark chapter 1, verses 19 through 20, when John and his brother James are called to be disciples, it's noted that when they leave their father with the hired servants. John's family was a wealthy enough fishing business that it wasn't just a family business. John's father had a large number of hired servants who worked with him. He wasn't just a small fishery, he was a large fishery. And so he may have been wealthier than one might have think of when they think of a fisher person from Galilee. And so very likely John's family had some sort of ties either through marriage or something like that the high priestly family knew him. It's not known for certain, but it's likely. Some other ideas that commentators put through who this other disciple might be is it just some disciple who is never named, who isn't part of the inner 11, who is known by the priest. And that certainly could be, but it doesn't really fit the other clues, especially since at this point all of Jesus' disciples have been scattered and fleeing, and we have Peter, who's kind of the first brave one to venture out. It would make more sense that instead of an unnamed disciple on the periphery, that it would be somebody who is center with Peter. Some have suggested that this is Judas, a very small number, and their argument is, what disciple would better know the high priest than Judas, because Judas has hired him. And actually, the high priest has hired Judas as part of the conspiracy, and that Judas is, of course, going into the courtyard to be there because he was part of the arresting party. That's possible, but then it's like, why is Peter with him? And some point out, well, Peter's about to deny him, so Peter was kind of on the fence right now. And it's like, maybe, maybe not. And also in the confusion at this point, it may not have been clear to Peter that Judas was the one who betrayed Jesus, but that seems unlikely since Judas was the one guiding and leading the army of soldiers who showed up to arrest Jesus when Peter pulled out his sword. It seems like Peter would be less likely to go with Judas rather than to pull his sword on Judas at this point. So it seems kind of unlikely. The other problem with that is timeline-wise, it's much more likely that at this point, Judas isn't going to Annas' home. He's peeled off and he's going to the Sanhedrin because he has remorse and regret. He's trying to get out of this plan that he's agreed to because he's done part of the betrayal, witness to Pilate, leading the arresting soldiers to the garden. But he has one more role to play. And that is to betray Jesus as a witness before the Roman authorities. And he may be doing the math here and thinking, if this goes sideways, it's not going to be Jesus who gets crucified, it's going to be him who gets crucified. And so he's having remorse and regret over this. And that leads him into this spiral that he ends up killing himself. And one might think, why would he kill himself if his concern was being killed by Rome? Well, that's just how bad crucifixion was. It was just absolutely so horrible. We get our word excruciating from the word crucifixion. That Judas very well may have decided He wanted no more part of this because he didn't want to be killed by Rome as a traitor against Rome. And so in this remorse and regret, he spiraled, and the decision he came up with to solve his problem was he might as well end his own life. So it's likely that this would not be Judas because Judas was otherwise occupied during this time period. And rather than being filled with remorse and regret and turning back to Jesus, he turned away and continued and doubled down on his rejection. Whereas Peter, on the other hand, when he denies, he has remorse and regret also, but instead of spiraling inward, he looks outward to Jesus. So we have then Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple, likely John. And now that disciple is known to the high priest and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. Now here, going in with Jesus is not indicating that John is accompanying Jesus as moral support or as a loyal disciple or as legal counsel or as a witness in his behalf. It's just differentiating that at this point, John is in the courtyard where Jesus has been taken for the trial into the courtroom, so to speak, and is his house. And Peter, meanwhile, verse 16, stood at the door outside. He is still completely outside. And somewhat this is also a literary foreshadowing that right now, Peter, with his relationship with Jesus, is somewhat on the outside. And then the other disciple, who was known to the high priest, went out and spoke to who kept the door and brought Peter in. So John realizes he's made it into the courtyard, looks around, Peter isn't there, and goes back outside, grabs Peter, introduces him to the servant at the door and says, he's with me, he can come in, it's fine. And she's like, fine, what do I care, let him in. And then the servant girl who kept the door says to Peter, you are not also one of the man's disciples, are you? And Peter says, I am not. And with each of his denials, his first one is just a simple statement. Each one, he gets more and more aggressive with his statements and more strongly and emotionally invested in them. But his first one, he just denies it. And that's kind of understandable because the other people who are in this courtyard are some of the temple police, possibly even some of the Roman soldiers still, who just arrested Jesus, who he just fled from. And he was also the one who drew the sword and cut the high priest's ear off, who he's just walked into that guy's household, basically. He kind of keeps a low profile here because he's just cut off the high priest's servant's ear. And even though the guy's ear was healed and that sort of thing, that high priest servant might be around with his other servant friends, and they might want to take Peter out back and have some words with him. And so he denies this. But it's also interesting how her question is phrased. You are not also one of the man's disciples. There are some who think the phrasing there indicates that this servant girl knew that John was a disciple of Jesus and did not have a problem with that because she let him in and she didn't go running to the guards and say, hey, this guy here, he's one of Jesus' disciples. So she may be kind of asking here, well, you know, there's not two of you here tonight. And Peter's like, nope, I am not. It's also interesting, the phrasing there in I am not, in that Jesus has used that phrasing, I am he, to witness to who he was as the Jehovah God, the great I am, where Peter is distancing himself. He's acting like an outsider, but understandably so. I know in a similar type of circumstances, I would do exactly the same thing. Actually, I probably wouldn't, because I wouldn't have even been that close to be questioned. I wouldn't have been following that close. So now the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself. And here Peter is even more pictured as an outsider in that he is warming himself around a fire with the individuals who just arrested Jesus and the servants who are those who are putting Jesus on trial. Warming oneself around a fire is kind of a picture of fellowship. He's fellowshipping with the wrong people at this point. Now, on a more promising note, another coal of fires shows up later in the book of John, in chapter 21. And then as they stood, they had come to land. They saw a fire of coals there and a fish laid on it and bread. And here, the disciples, Peter included, see Jesus at a coal of fires where he has prepared a meal of fish and bread that he's inviting them to partake of. And Peter jumps out of the boat because the boat isn't moving fast enough, gets to shore the first to fellowship around this fire with Jesus. The high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. So here at the same time that Peter is warming himself around the fire, having denied Jesus, Jesus is being questioned about his disciples. At the point in which his disciples are outside, one of them denying him, Jesus is inside at the very same time. And here it says the high priest. And this is where it gets potentially a little confusing. Because is this Caiaphas or is this Annas? Now, because it's in Annas' house, and because Caiaphas would have been in the temple, and not only that, in verse 24, we have then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas. It becomes clear that in verse 19, the person questioning Jesus is not the ruling high priest Caiaphas, it's Annas, the wannabe high priest, the patriarch of the family, the one by Jewish tradition would have still been high priest. And this is likely an intentionary literary decision here that is pointing the reader throughout this to start to question, who's really the high priest here? Is it Annas? Is it Caiaphas? And the answer the reader should come through by the end of this, it's not Annas. It's not Caiaphas. It's the true high priest. It's Jesus himself, who is being questioned about his disciples and his doctrine. And so Jesus answers him. He answers Annas. I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always met. And in secret I have said nothing. So there's a double meaning here. We've seen in the Gospel of John a lot of double meanings. And here what Jesus is doing is he's saying two things. One, the straightforward meaning is he had one message that was consistent, both public and private. He did teach privately with his disciples, but he didn't teach anything that he wasn't proclaiming out in the open in the temple publicly for everybody to hear. But see, also, Jewish trials were supposed to be held by the Sanhedrin in an open and public way in the temple, not in a private, secret place. So Jesus is both saying what he did, he taught openly, publicly, as one should do under Jewish law, as opposed to what Annas is doing by questioning him in an illegitimate trial in a private residence secretly at night. And some of the arresting individuals were individuals who shouldn't have been involved with the arrest. Because in Jewish law, anybody who was possibly going to be a judge in the Sanhedrin was not to be part of the arresting party, because that would show partiality where they were supposed to be impartial when they made their judgments. And so here Jesus is pointing out two things. One, he did nothing wrong, and by the way, Annas is doing everything wrong. Verse 21, why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And here there's a double meaning also. First, those who have heard me, Jesus is referring to his disciples. And not only that, indeed they know. The ones that Jesus says know him are his sheep. So not just individuals who are the casual disciples in the Gospel of John who really aren't followers. But here Jesus is saying, you should go ask my true disciples. Well, what was Jesus doing in the farewell discourse? He was preparing his disciples and telling them, you are no longer just students learning at my feet. You are now being commissioned to participate, and your participation is you're supposed to be telling people about the truth. You're supposed to be sharing the gospel about Jesus. And so what Jesus is saying to Annas is, go ask the people who I just commissioned to be the foundation of the church. The people that he prayed for in chapter 17, where he says, I do not pray for these, his current disciples alone, but also for those who will believe in me through their word. So Jesus is again confirming that despite the fact that right now his disciples are scattered, and one of them's right outside denying him and not being a very good witness, that they will be successful witnesses, and they are the ones that Annas and everyone else should be looking to for the truth and the witness. The second thing he's doing is he's also pointing out something that, again, Annas is doing wrong. Under Jewish law, 2 or 3 witnesses were required, and not only that, witnesses in support of the defendant were supposed to be heard first, and the defendant was not supposed to be allowed to incriminate himself. There was concerns that a defendant who was suicidal might falsely incriminate himself so that he could be killed, or somebody who knew who the true culprit was would lie. And so because of that, in Jewish court, the individual who was on trial was not to be called as a witness and was not to be questioned. It was supposed to be at least a minimum of 2 or 3 witnesses for him and at least 2 or 3 witnesses against him. And if no witnesses could be found for him, that was actually considered a mistrial. Because it was considered that if nobody would speak up in favor of the defendant, that was impossible and there had to be a conspiracy afoot. If in the trial there was a unanimous vote of guilty, the person was released. Because they believed that there was no way 23 to 71 Jewish men could agree 100% unanimously unless there was a conspiracy. Now, there could be unanimous for acquittal. So they very much had that concept of innocent before guilty. And Jesus points that out here. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, do you answer the high priest like that? And it's interesting here, the question of who's the high priest here. Well, the true high priest is the one who is just struck across the face with the palm. And so Jesus is being asked, you're talking back to the high priest, how dare you do that? And at the same time, they've just arrested the true high priest, the Son of God, and slapped him. And in a trial, that was also illegal. You were not supposed to mistreat somebody during a trial. To strike somebody with a fist was a 4 denarii, a 4 days' wages penalty. To slap somebody with an open palm was such an offense that it was a 200 denarii fine, almost a year's wages. To spit on somebody was a 400 denarii fine, over a year's wages. Those are all considered illegal things that should not be done against a defendant by Jewish law. None of those fines were levied in this case, but they were there. And I am way over time and not even where I wanted to get to, so we'll continue chapter 18 next time. And Pastor, could you close in prayer quickly?
Lord Jesus Christ, we